For this video, we're going to cover the basics of a shaper and a little bit on the routers. Now, this is a small hand router, and there are different models and makes, and they look a little different, but they all share some similar features. Basically, a router is a motor with handles, and it spins a sharp bit, just around and around and around. Now, depending on which bit you're using, could be bigger, could be smaller, it will perform a different function or give you a different profile. So we'll talk a little bit more about these a little later on. A shaper is basically a router on steroids. It is much, much bigger. You put a much larger motor on it, and it's so heavy that you either mount it under a table or under a metal machine. So it depends on the setup. However, because the motor is so much bigger, it can spin much bigger bits. This one is one of my medium-sized bits, and again, depending on its profile or shape, it'll do a different function. So these, of course, can be very dangerous, like any machine. Because I'm going to be pushing my board into these bits one after another, depending on what I'm doing, you need to watch out for what you're doing. You need to pay attention. One little look in a different way, you could easily get a hand into a shaper bit. Now, I have multiple shapers in this shop, and a lot of shops do. Mine happens to have 8 of them that happen to do different specific things. So we have shapers in here that will do a cope and a stick for putting together a door. We have a shaper that will follow a pattern if you want to copy something over and over and over again. In the front, we have a couple of shapers that will do different profiles for base trim or the lid of whatever project we're building. We have another one that does a cove cut that fits into that same door, the cope and stick with the cove bit, and it all fits together. But today we're going to focus on just one or two, just a few of them, so you understand the basic procedures, the safety features that all of them share. Let's go through some of the basics of the shaper and some safety issues that all of them will share. First of all, regardless of the shaper, it could turn either direction. So look at your shaper and make sure you know to go opposite the rotation. This particular shaper, and all of mine are set up the same, go in counterclockwise direction. So look at it, which means I have to go this way, opposite the rotation as I'm pushing my board through. If I go with the rotation, it's turning the direction that the board already wants to go, and it will end up flipping it across the shop and maybe injuring someone else. So make sure always go opposite. As you're cutting, where do you start? So on this board, we have end grain here and here, and we have edge grain there and there. What happens is, before I get to that, is when I go across, the blade is cutting the end, and it will want to tear out the last little bit of wood on end grain. It always does. And I flip it around, I do the same thing. On edge grain, it will not tear out anything because the lines of grain are going the direction I'm cutting, so there's nothing to rip off. So what we want to do is always cut end grain first. You'll get any tear out that's going to happen will happen here. Then I turn the board, here's where I ended my cut, and begin where I stopped my last cut. That will now shave away whatever tear out I got on that cut. Then I turn and repeat. I'll cut, get a little tear out, turn, and remove all that tear out. Now, some boards, some woods are harder than others, and they will get more tear out than others. A softer wood, you'll get a little less tear out, and vice versa. So to keep the tear out to a minimum, we're going to use a backing board. This is the one that I have for this shaper, and they may look a little bit different, but they're all the same in that they go behind whatever you're cutting, and you're going to cut into this board. So that actually goes across the blade with it. All this does is it supports the end grain that's going to be tearing out so that it's minimized. You may get a little, but this will help a lot. So simply put it here and run it across. And you can see that there is a little tear out. That's going to be shaved away when we do the next cut here, but the rest of it is quite clean. There's a tiny little bit, and that's exactly what I was hoping to see. Now when I go back and do the edge, that will look nice and clean. How do I know if I'm supposed to use this any more often? When you're cutting, if it's difficult to keep it tight against the fence, keep it from wobbling, and I've found that anything less than about 6 inches wide it's kind of tricky to keep it straight across a fence like this. Use this backing board. Use some kind of support. Honestly, you could even use another piece of wood. As long as this is square, holding it straight, that would also work. This backing board, of course, serves a double purpose. It has a better handle. Now, we don't need it here on the edge, like I mentioned, because we're not going to get tear out, and it's bigger than 6 inches. But anytime any piece is less than 6 and always on end grain, use a backing board to get a clean cut. Now, as you're cutting, a lot of sawdust is going to appear on the table. Depending on the shaper, you'll get more or less. It just depends on which one you're using. Now, if I have a pile of sawdust under the board, I put the board on top. Now my board isn't sitting flat, it's going to wobble because there's a mountain of something underneath it. It won't be able to cut as deep as it's supposed to. It won't be nice and clean. So make sure to blow the sawdust away. You can use your hand, but only if the shaper is not running. Make sure it is off and stopped. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen students that, while it's running, have gone like this and ended up getting their finger into the shaper. It does happen. So turn it off or blow it away with your breath. That way nothing is going into the shaper. Then put this down on a clean surface each time. So whenever I'm done cutting, if I pick it up, you must get rid of the sawdust here. If I finish my cut and then just slide it over again, I'm not as worried because I didn't pick it up to put it on some new pile. That's more technique. That is up to you, that you'll learn as you're using the shaper more. When you're about to cut, how fast should you go? This again is one of those technique things that you will just learn over time. However, the basic safety of this is if I go too slow, I'll usually get a burn. Because now I'm going too slow, there's a lot more friction in one spot. It's going to heat up, you get a burn. If I go too fast, I have the same result if I went too fast on the jointer, ripples. And usually it'll end up tearing out even worse. It'll grab and rip this pieces off instead of shaving and slicing them off like it's meant to do. Where should I place my hands on the board while I'm shaping? Now obviously guys, don't put your hand directly in line with the blade, so I'm going, if something slips, I don't want to go directly into the blade. But the opposite can also be a problem. Putting your hands way far away like this and trying to hold it across, this tends to lift up. And if that lifts off the table, then you don't get a clean cut. It ends up being very wavy. So there is a downside of actually being too far away from the blade. So usually the idea is to stay at about 3 inches away. That's your margin of safety, about 3 inches from that bit. So here, and I'm trying to stay close to that 3 because I need pressure down on the table. This hand is keeping pressure into the fence. As you go across, if I slip, I'm not going to go straight in. So keep your hands close to the bit, but outside of that 3-inch margin of safety. If you happen to have a shaper set up with a power feeder, that is really nice because then the power feeder will do the jobs of holding it down into the fence and speed. Take those decisions away from you, so it's already set up. But the thing about the power feeder is if I just take it and put it in lightly and then let go, feeders sometimes will pull the board away from the fence just a little immediately. As soon as it goes under the wheel, it'll jerk away, then it slowly pushes it back while it's in the middle of the cutter, which means you won't get a straight cut. So when you have a power feeder, keep your hands tight as if it wasn't there and keep them on there until I have to let go. Obviously, I don't want my fingers underneath the wheels. I don't want to pinch my fingers. But hold on to the board until the end gets to the wheels themselves. This particular setup has what's called a feather board on it. It's just a piece of wood with a bunch of slots cut in it. The idea is simply, it's a spring. When I put my board underneath it, these will flex and hold the board down tight onto the table. And depending on the setup, this will be tight or loose, but either way, it holds it tight to the table while you're holding it tight to the fence. I mentioned before that we're going to talk a little bit about routers, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. As you're cutting, the rules are very much the same. Obviously, you have to keep your hands on the handles or keeping it flat, but remember, going too fast will give you more tear out, going too slow gives you a burn, but also holding it flat on there and making sure that you're going the right pace, the right speed, and using the correct bit for the right job. In addition, make sure Always do end grain first, even with a hand router, because you're still going to get that tear out that you want to be able to shave off on your next cut.